Section 33 of the Endeavour Journal of Sir Joseph Banks. Journal from 25 August 1768 to 12 July 1771 by Joseph Banks. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Gail Timmerman Vaughan. Section 33. Account of New Zealand, Part 2. Both sexes were much more modest in their carriage and decent in their conversation than the islanders, which such of our people who had a mind to form any connection with the women soon found, but they were not impregnable. If the consent of their relations was asked, and the question accompanied with a proper present, it was seldom refused. But then the strictest decency must be kept up towards the young lady, or she might balk the lover after all. Upon one of our gentlemen making his addresses to a family of the better sort, the following answer was made him by the mistress of the family: "Any of these young ladies will think themselves honoured by your addresses, but you must first make me a proper present, and must come and sleep with us ashore, for daylight should by no means be a witness of such proceedings." Neither sex are quite so cleanly in their persons as the islanders. Not having the advantage of so warm a climate, they do not wash so often, but the most disgustful thing about them is the oil with which they daub their hair. This is melted from the fat either of fish or birds. The better sort, indeed, have it fresh, and it is entirely void of smell, but the inferior often use that is rancid, and consequently smell something like Greenland dock when they are trying whale blubber. Both sexes stain themselves with the colour of black, in the same manner and something in the same method as the South Sea Islanders, introducing it under the skin by a sharp instrument furnished with many teeth. But the men carry this custom to much greater lengths, and the women not so far. They are generally content with having their lips blacked, but sometimes have patches of black on different parts of their bodies. The men, on the contrary, seem to add to their quantity every year of their lives, so that some of the elder are almost covered with it. Their faces are the most remarkable. On them they, by some art unknown to me, dig furrows in their faces, a line deep at least, and as broad, the edges of which are often again indented and most perfectly black. This may be done to make them look frightful in war. Indeed, it has the effect of making them most enormously ugly, the old ones at least, whose faces are entirely covered with it. The young again often have a small patch on one cheek, or over an eye, and those under a certain age, maybe 25 or 26, have no more than their lips black. Yet, ugly as this certainly looks, it is impossible to avoid admiring the eminence, elegance, and justness of the figures in which it is formed, which in the face is always different spirals. Upon the body, generally different figures, resembling sometimes the foliages of old, chasing upon gold or silver, all these finished with a masterly taste and execution. For of 100, which at first sight you would judge to be exactly the same, on a close examination, no 2 will prove alike. Nor do I remember to have seen any 2 alike, for their wild imaginations scorn to copy as appears in almost all their works. In different parts of the coast they varied very much in the quantity and parts of the body on which this amoko, as they call it, was placed, but in the spirals upon their faces they generally agreed, and I have generally observed that the more populous a country was the greater quantity of this amoko they had. Possibly in populous countries the emulation of bearing pain with fortitude may be carried to greater lengths than where there are fewer people and consequently fewer examples to encourage. The buttocks, which in the islands was the principal seat of this ornament in general, here escapes untouched. In one place only we saw the contrary. Possibly they might on this account be esteemed as more noble, as having transferred the seat of their ornament from the dishonourable cheeks of their tail to the more honourable ones of their heads. Besides this dyeing in grain, as it may be called, they are very fond of painting themselves with red ochre, which they do in 2 ways, either rubbing it dry upon their skins, which some few do, or daubing their faces with large patches of it, mixed with oil, which consequently never dries. This latter is generally practised by the women, and was most universally condemned by us, for if any of us had unthinkingly ravished a kiss from one of these fair savages, our transgressions were wrote in more legible characters on our noses, which our companions could not fail to see on our first interview. The common dress of these people is certainly to a stranger at first one of the most uncouth and extraordinary sights that can be imagined. It is made of the leaves of the flag described before, which are split into 3 or 4 slips each, and these, as soon as they are dry, are wove into a kind of stuff between netting and cloth, out of the upper side of which all the ends, of 8 or 9 inches long each, are suffered to hang in the same manner as thrums out of a thrum mat. Of these pieces of cloth 2 serve for a complete dress, one of which is tied over the shoulders and reaches about their knees, the other about the waist, which reaches near the ground. But they seldom wear more than one of these, and when they have it on resemble not a little a thatched house. These dresses, however ugly as they are well adapted for their convenience, who are often obliged to sleep in the open air, and live some time without the least shelter, even from rain, so that they must trust entirely to their clothes as the only chance they have of keeping themselves dry, for which they are certainly not ill adapted, as every strip of leaf becomes in that case a kind of gutter, which serves to conduct the rain down and hinder it from soaking through the cloth beneath. Besides this, they have several kinds of cloth, which is smooth and ingeniously enough worked. They are chiefly of 2 sorts, one coarse as our coarsest canvas, and 10 times stronger, but much like it in the tying of the threads. The other is formed by many threads running lengthwise, and only a few crossing them, which tie them together. This last sort is sometimes striped, and always very pretty, for the threads that compose it are prepared so as to shine almost as much as silk. To both these they work borders of different colours and fine stitches, something like carpeting or girls' samplers in various patterns, with an ingenuity truly surprising to anyone who will reflect that they are without needles. They also have mats with which they sometimes cover themselves, but the great pride of their dress seems to consist in dog's fur, which they use so sparingly that to avoid waste they cut into long strips and sew them at a distance from each other upon their cloth, varying often the colours prettily enough. When first we saw these dresses, we took them for the skins of bears, or some animal of that kind, but we were soon undeceived, and found upon inquiry that they were acquainted with no animal that had fur or long hair but their own dogs. Some there were who had these dresses ornamented with feathers, and one who had an entire dress of the red feathers of parrots, but these were not common. The men always wore short beards, and tied their hair in a small knot on the top of their heads, sticking into it a kind of comb, and at the top 2 or 3 white feathers. About their waists was tied a belt, from which hung a string, which was tied round their preputium, and in this seemed to consist most or all of their decency in that particular, for when that was tied they often exposed by different motions every part of their bodies to our view, and indeed not seldom threw off all other dress, but showed visible reluctance and signs of shame when we desired them to untie it, from a curiosity to see the manner in which it was tied. The first man we saw when we went ashore in Poverty Bay, who was killed by one of our people, had his dress tied on exactly in the same manner as is represented in Mr. Dalrymple's account of Tasman's voyage, in a plate which I believe is copied from Valentine's History of the East Indies. It was tied over his shoulders, across his breast, again under his armpits, likewise across his breast, and round his loins. Of this dress we saw, however, but one more instance during our whole stay on the coast, though it seems convenient, as it leaves the arms quite at liberty while the body is covered. In general, indeed, when they are close to set their arms at liberty, they at the same time freed all their other limbs by casting off their clothes entirely. The women, contrary to the custom of the sex in general, seemed to affect dress rather less than the men. Their hair, which they wore short, was seldom tied, and if it was behind their heads, and never ornamented with feathers. Their clothes were of the same stuff, and in the same form as those of the men, but in decently covering themselves they far exceeded them. Their lower garments were at all times bound fast round them, and they never exposed to view anything even in the neighbourhood of those parts which nature conceals, except when they gathered lobsters and shellfish, in which occupation they were frequently obliged to dive. But then they never meant to be seen by men, and when once or twice accidentally met by us, most evident signs of confusion, veiling as well as they could their naked beauties with seaweed, the only covering their situation afforded. Round their waists, instead of a belt, they constantly wore a girdle of many plaited strings made of the leaves of a very fragrant grass. Into this were tucked the leaves of some sweet-scented plant, fresh gathered, which, like the fig leaf of our first mother, served as the ultimate guard of their modesty. Both sexes bored their ears, and wore in them a great variety of ornaments. The holes by stretching were generally large enough to admit a finger at least. These generally, as if to keep them upon the stretch, were filled up with a plug of some sort or other, either cloth, feathers, bones of large birds, or sometimes only a stick of wood. Into this hole they often also put nails, or anything we gave them, which could be put there. The women also wore bunches of the down of the albatross, which is snow white, near as large as a fist, which, though very odd, made by no means an unelegant appearance. Besides these, they hung to them, by strings, many very different things, often chisels or bodkins, made of a kind of green talc, which they value much, the nails and teeth also of their deceased relations, dogs' teeth, and in short everything they could get which was either valuable or ornamental. Besides these, the women wore bracelets and anklets, made of the bones of birds, shells, etc., and the men often had the figure of a distorted man made of the before-mentioned green talc, or the tooth of a whale cut slantwise, so as something to resemble a tongue, and furnished with 2 eyes. These they wore about their necks, and seemed to value almost above everything else. I saw one instance also of a very extraordinary ornament, which was a feather stuck through the bridge of the nose, and projecting on each side of it over the cheeks. But this I only mention as a singular thing, having met with it only once among the many people I have seen, and never observed it in any other, even the marks of a hole which might occasionally serve for such purpose. Their houses are certainly the most inartificially made of anything among them, scarce equal to an European dog kennel, and resembling one in the door at least, which is barely high and wide enough to admit a man crawling upon all fours. They are seldom more than 16 or 18 feet long, 8 or 10 broad, and 5 or 6 high from the ridgepole to the ground, and built with a sloping roof, like our European houses. The materials of both walls and roof is dry grass or hay, and very tightly it is put together, so that necessarily they must be very warm. Some are lined with bark of trees on the inside, and many have either over the door or fixed somewhere in the house a piece of plank, covered with their carving, which they seem to value as much as we do a picture, placing it always as conspicuously as possible. All these houses have the door at one end, and near it is generally a square hole, which serves for a window, or probably in winter time more for a chimney, for then they light a fire in the middle of the house. At the same end, where this door and window are placed, the side walls and roof project, generally 18 inches or 2 feet beyond the end wall, making a kind of porch, in which are benches where the people of the house often sit. Within is a square place fenced off, with either boards or stones from the rest, in the middle of which they can make a fire. Round this the sides of the house are thick laid, with straw on which they sleep. As for furniture, they are not much troubled with it. One chest commonly contains all their riches, consisting of tools, clothes, arms, and a few feathers to stick into their hair. Their gourds and baskets made of bark, which serve them to keep fresh water, provision baskets, and the hammers with which they beat their fern roots, are generally left without the door. Mean and low as these houses are, they most perfectly resist all inclemencies of the weather, and answer consequently the purposes of mere shelter, as well as larger would do. The people, I believe, spend little of the day in them, except maybe in winter. The porch seems to be the place for work, and those who have not room there must set upon a stone or the ground in its neighbourhood. Some few of the better sort have kind of court walls, the walls of which are made of poles and hay, 10 or 12 feet high, which, as their families are large, encloses 3 or 4 houses. But I must not forget the ruins, or rather frame of a house, for it had never been finished, which I saw at Tolaga, as it was so much superior in size to anything of the kind we have met with in any other part of the land. It was 30 feet in length, in breadth, and high. The sides of it were ornamented with many broad carved planks of a workmanship superior to any we saw upon the land, but for what purpose this was built, or why deserted, we could not find out. Though these people when at home defend themselves so well from the inclemencies of the weather, yet when abroad upon their excursions, which they often make in search of fern roots, fish, etc., they seem totally indifferent of shelter. Sometimes they make a small shade to windward of them, but oftener omit that precaution. During our stay at Opurach, or Mercury Bay, such a party of Indians were there consisting of 40 or 50, who during all that time never erected the least covering, though twice it rained, almost without ceasing, for 24 hours together. Their food in the use of which they seem to be moderate, consists of dogs, birds, especially seafowl such as penguins, albatrosses, etc., fish, sweet potatoes, yams, cocoas, some few wild plants such as sow thistles, palm cabbage, etc., but above all, and which seems to be to them what bread is to us, the roots of a species of fern very common upon the hills, and which very nearly resembles that which grows on our hilly commons in England, and is called indifferently fern, bracken, or brakes. As for the flesh of men, although they certainly do eat it, I cannot, in my own opinion, debase human nature so much as to imagine that they relish as a dainty, or even look upon it as a part of common food. Though thirst of revenge may drive men to great lengths when the passions are allowed to take their full swing, yet nature, through all the superior part of the creation, shows how much she recoils at the thought of any species preying upon itself. Dogs and cats show visible signs of disgust at the very sight of a dead carcass of their species. Even wolves or bears were never said to eat one another, except in cases of absolute necessity, when the stings of hunger have overcome the precepts of nature, in which case the same has been done by the inhabitants of the most civilized nations. Among fish and insects, indeed, there are many instances which prove that those who live by prey regard little whether what they take is of their own or any other species. But anyone who considers the admirable chain of nature in which man, alone endowed with reason, justly claims the highest rank, and next to him are placed the half-reasoning elephant, the sagacious dog, the architect beaver, etc., in whom instinct so nearly resembles reason as to have been mistaken for it by men of no mean capacities, from these descending through the less informed quadrupeds and birds to the fish and insects, which seem, besides the instinct of fear which is given them for self-preservation, to be moved only by the stings of hunger to eat and those of lust to propagate their species, which when born are left entirely to their own care, and at last by the medium of the oyster, etc., etc., which not being able to move, but as tossed about by the waves, must in themselves be furnished with both sexes, that the species may be continued, shading itself away into the vegetable kingdom, for the preservation of whom neither sensation nor instinct is wanting. Whoever considers this, I say, will easily see that no conclusion in favour of such a practice can be drawn from the actions of a race of beings placed so infinitely below us in the order of nature. But to return to my subject. Simple as their food is, their cookery, as far as I saw, is as simple. A few stones heated hot and laid in a hole, their meat laid upon it and covered with hay, seems to be the most difficult part of it. Fish and birds they generally broil, or rather toast, spitting them upon a long skewer, the bottom of which is fixed under a stone, and another stone being put under the forepart of the skewer, it is raised or lowered by moving that stone as the circumstances may require. The fern roots are laid upon the open fire until they are thoroughly hot, and the bark of them burnt to a caul. They are then beat with a wooden hammer over a stone, which causes all the bark to fly off, and leaves the inside consisting of a small proportion of a glutinous pulp, mixed with many fibres, which they generally spit out, after having sucked each mouthful a long time. Strange and unheard of as it must appear to an European, to draw nourishment from a class of plant which in Europe no animal, hardly even insects, will taste, I am inclined to think that it affords a nourishing and wholesome diet. These people eat but little, and this is the foundation of their meals, all summer at least, from the time that their roots are planted till the season for digging them up. All summer at least, from the time that their roots are planted till the season for digging them up. Among them I have seen many very healthy old men, and in general the whole of them are as vigorous a race as can be imagined. To the southward, where little or nothing is planted, fern roots and fish must serve them all the year. Here, therefore, we saw that they had made vast piles of both, especially the latter, which were dried in the sun very well, I suppose meant for winter stock, when possibly fish is not so plentiful, or the trouble of catching it is greater in the winter. Water is their universal drink, nor did I see any signs of any other liquor being at all known to them, or any method of intoxication. If they really have not, happy they must be allowed to be above all other nations that I at least have heard of. So simple a diet, accompanied with moderation, must be productive of sound health, which indeed these people are blessed with in a very high degree. Though we were in several of their towns, where young and old crowded to see us, actuated by the same curiosity as made us desirous of seeing them, I do not remember a single instance of a person distempered in any degree that came under my inspection. and among the numbers of them that I have seen naked, I have never seen an eruption on the skin, or any signs of one by scars or otherwise. Their skins, indeed, when they came off to us in their canoes, were often marked in patches with a white floury appearance, which at first deceived us, but we afterwards found that that was owing to their having been in their passage wetted with the spray of the sea, which when it was dry left the salt behind it in a fine white powder. Such health drawn from so sound principles must make physicians almost useless. Indeed, I am inclined to think that their knowledge of physic is but small from the state of their surgery, which more than once came under my inspection. Of this art they seemed totally ignorant. I saw several who were wounded by our shot, without the smallest application upon their wounds. One in particular who had a musket ball shot through the fleshy part of his arm. He came out of his house and showed himself to us, making a little use of the wounded arm. The wound, which was then of several days' standing, was totally void of inflammation, seemed well digested, in short, appeared to me to be in so good a state that had any application been made use of, I should not have failed to inquire carefully what it had been which had had so good an effect. A farther proof, and not a weak one, of the sound health that these people enjoy, may be taken from the number of old people we saw. Hardly a canoe came off to us that did not bring one or more, and every town had several, whom, if we may judge by grey hairs and worn-out teeth, were of a very advanced age. Of these few or none were decrepit. Indeed, the greatest number of them seemed in vivacity and cheerfulness to equal the young, indeed to be inferior to them in nothing but the want of equal strength and agility. End of section 33. Part 2 of Account of New Zealand.